There is a knitted cap, navy blue or possibly black. The witnesses who saw it could not agree on the exact color, and that detail, small as it seems, tells you something important about the chaos of the morning it was left behind. It was found on the ground on Asgatan Street in Linköping, Sweden, on the morning of October 19th, 2004. The person who left it there had just killed 2 people. He had not run. He had walked away, calmly, according to every witness account, leaving the cap on the pavement behind him. The cap contained his DNA, a full genetic profile, complete, unambiguous. Collected within hours of the murders and entered into the evidence record of what would become the second largest criminal investigation in Swedish history. The answer to the most important question in the case was in that cap from the very first day. For 16 years, nobody could use it. I want to walk you through those 16 years. Not because the story of how a cold case gets solved is simple, but because the gap between having evidence and being able to act on it, the specific, technical, legal, human gap, is the part of this case that nobody talks about when they talk about the Linköping murders. And it is, I think, the most important part. But first, before the evidence, before the investigation, before the 16 years, you need to know who was on Asgatan Street that morning. Mohammed Ammouri was 8 years old. He was walking to school. That is the entirety of what he was doing on the morning of October 19th, 2004. The most ordinary thing an 8-year-old does on an autumn weekday in a quiet Swedish city. He had been alive for 8 years. He had a family who described him as a happy child who loved school. He had a Tuesday morning and a route he had probably walked many times before. There was no reason to be afraid. Anna-Lena Svensson was 56 years old. She lived on Asgatan Street. On that same morning, she had just left her home, the mundane start of an ordinary day, when she witnessed what was happening to Mohammed. She intervened. I want to pause on that for a moment, because Anna-Lena Svensson did not have to do what she did. She could have retreated. She could have called for help from a distance. She was 56 years old, and she saw a child being attacked, and she chose to physically intervene. She was stabbed for it. She died at the hospital. Linköping was, in 2004, exactly the kind of place where this was not supposed to happen. A mid-sized city in southern Sweden, university town, quiet streets, the particular calm of a Scandinavian autumn. The murders shocked the nation not just because of their brutality, but because of their randomness. There was no apparent connection between Mohammed and Anna-Lena. There was no clear motive. There was no obvious reason why this street, this morning, these 2 people. The only person who knew why was the one who walked away. Here is what investigators found at the scene. The murder weapon. A butterfly knife. Left behind. The knitted cap. Left behind. From both items, forensic scientists extracted a clear DNA profile belonging to the perpetrator, his blood type, his genetic markers, everything required to identify him, if there was something to match it against. Witnesses provided descriptions. A man in his 20s, a beige knee-length jacket, the knitted cap, navy or black, and then this detail, which appears in every witness account, and which investigators found deeply unusual. He did not run. He walked away from the scene at a normal pace, calmly, as if nothing had happened. That behavioral detail, the calm departure, became one of the defining threads of the investigation. What kind of person commits 2 murders on an open street in broad daylight and walks away without running? The investigation that followed was, by any measure, enormous. 7,000 interviews, 13,000 tips submitted to police, 5,000 separate DNA tests conducted on individuals, men in the relevant age range, men who matched witness descriptions. men with any conceivable connection to the scene or the victims. The case file grew to become the second largest in Swedish history, behind only the 1986 assassination of Prime Minister Olof Palme. Investigators called in the FBI for assistance. The FBI reviewed the evidence and the profile and offered what analysis they could. It was not enough. For 9 years, by the count of one peer-reviewed case study, investigators conducted over 9,000 interrogations and screened more than 6,000 men for DNA matches. Each test came back negative. The profile in the evidence file did not match anyone in any national or international database that investigators had access to. The DNA was not the problem. The DNA was perfect. The DNA was, in the language of forensic science, a complete solution to the identification question. Sitting in an evidence file, waiting for a name that never came. I need to explain why. Because I think the natural question, when you hear that investigators had a full DNA profile from day one, is, why did it take 16 years? And the answer is not about incompetence or negligence. It is about a specific collision between forensic capability and legal infrastructure. A gap that existed not just in Sweden, but across most of Europe. A DNA profile is only useful if you have something to compare it to. The comparison requires a database, a collection of genetic profiles that can be searched against the evidence sample. In the years following the Linköping murders, Sweden's national DNA database contained profiles collected under specific legal conditions, primarily from convicted offenders and from individuals formally charged with serious crimes. The perpetrator of the Asgatan murders had, apparently, no such record. He was not in the database. The broader question, whether investigators could search commercial genealogy databases, where millions of ordinary people had voluntarily uploaded their own DNA for ancestry research, was not a legal option in Sweden in 2004, or in 2010, or in 2015. European data protection frameworks and the specific legal constraints around forensic use of private genetic data meant that the vast repositories of family DNA that existed on platforms like GED Match and Family Tree were, for investigators, effectively invisible. And then, in 2018, something happened in California. A man named Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested. He had been evading identification for over 40 years as the so-called Golden State Killer, responsible for at least 13 murders and more than 50 rapes across California in the 1970s and 1980s. He was identified through a method called investigative genetic genealogy. Investigators uploaded the crime scene DNA to a public genealogy platform, found distant relatives of the unknown perpetrator among the platform's users, and used traditional genealogical research to narrow the family tree down to a single suspect. They then obtained D'Angelo's DNA independently and confirmed the match. Swedish investigators read about this. They went to their legal authorities. They asked a question that the Linköping case had been waiting 16 years for someone to ask. Could we do this here? In January 2019, new Swedish legislation was passed that enabled police to search for DNA matches on commercial genealogy websites. The Linköping case was selected as the pilot study. A detective who had worked the case for years, who had never let it go, partnered with a genealogist. They uploaded the profile from the knitted cap to GED Match and Family Tree. They found distant relatives. Investigative genetic genealogy works, in simplified terms, like this. The DNA you share with relatives decreases the further the relationship. You share 50% with a parent, 25% with a grandparent, roughly 12% with a first cousin, and so on, down to fractions of a percent with distant cousins. When investigators find distant relatives in a genealogy database, they are not finding the suspect. They are finding a thread. A thread that, if followed carefully through public records, census data, family trees, and traditional detective work can lead eventually to a single living individual. In the Linköping case, the genealogical research identified two brothers as prime suspects. Investigators then conducted surveillance, traditional physical surveillance, and obtained a DNA sample from one of the brothers through discarded material. The sample was tested. It was a match. Daniel Nyqvist was arrested in June 2020. He was 37 years old. At the time of the murders, he had been 21, unemployed, living at his parents' home. He had remained in Linköping for 16 years after killing Mohammed Ammouri and Anna-Lena Svensson on an open street on a Tuesday morning, in the same city, possibly walking the same streets. He confessed shortly after his arrest. During the police interrogation, he said something that has stayed with investigators and journalists, and everyone who has followed this case ever since. He said he had obsessive thoughts about killing and had chosen his victims randomly. And then he said this: "I remember that I didn't brush my teeth because I was just going to die or get caught that day. But I had to do it. I did it mostly on automatic." He had not brushed his teeth because he expected to die or be arrested that morning. And then he was not arrested. And he went home. And he lived in Linköping for 16 more years. At trial in September 2020, medical experts concluded that Nyqvist had suffered from a psychiatric disorder. He was found guilty of both murders and sentenced to indefinite psychiatric care, the highest level of sentence available under Swedish law for individuals whose crimes are linked to serious mental illness, the CAP. It has been in an evidence file since October 19, 2004. It contained the answer from the first day, and the answer stayed locked inside it for 16 years. Not because of negligence, not because investigators stopped trying, but because the legal and technical framework to unlock it did not exist until 2019. This case is now studied in forensic science programs. The peer-reviewed paper published by Linköping University in May 2021 is cited in discussions of investigative genetic genealogy across Europe and beyond. It is described as the first time in European history that this method was used to solve a murder. The precedent it set has already helped other cases, will help more, but Mohammed Ammouri was 8 years old. He was walking to school, and Anna-Lena Svensson made a choice, the kind of choice that costs everything, and died because of it. They waited 16 years for the answer that was on that street from the first morning. I want to ask you something before I finish. Daniel Nyqvist lived in Linköping from 2004 to 2020. The families of Mohammed and Anna-Lena also lived with what happened on that street every year, every October 19th, while the person responsible was in the same city, walking the same streets, going about his life in the specific way that someone who expects to get caught and then doesn't goes about their life. The CAP solved the case. The method that unlocked the CAP will solve others. That matters. That is genuinely important. But the 16 years between 2004 and 2020 had a cost that no verdict and no precedent can fully address. And the honest question to sit with is not whether the system eventually worked. It did. But how many cases are still waiting for the legal framework to catch up? With the evidence that already exists, the CAP was always there. Remember Mohammed. Remember Anna-Lena. Not the hat. Not the database. Not the breakthrough. Them.